Hey, thanks for joining me. I want to talk to you about something that I call the hidden economy of open source and how it applies to Northeast Ohio. Let me start with a curious question. What do these things have to do with Northeast Ohio? Negotiating a deal in the Nordics a few weeks before the COVID lockdowns, a $2 billion software subscription business, graduating high school with a 1.66 grade point average, visiting Bolivia on a U.S. State Department sponsored mission, and working at a local Akron company called Interactive Media Group, as well as graduating from the University of Akron. This is a curious list of 5 things, and it might not seem obvious, but I promise I'll tie them together. To start, let's talk about something called open source and remote work. Many of you have probably heard of open source, but maybe you don't fully understand it. So I'll go a little deeper. If you go back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, when kind of the heyday of two guys or gals in a garage, would go in a go off for 3 or 4 months and try to tackle some cool secret project, and then they'd come out, and the idea is you'd get rich, right? You'd have some cool idea that was secret, and then you'd work on it for a while, and when you came out, you'd be ahead of everybody else, and you'd have something that works, and you'd somehow snag first mover advantage, essentially. And I think this was historically probably connected to the way innovation in manufacturing worked, where people were really sneaking and copying each other's patents and things like that. And so it comes from this sort of protectionist idea that if we can go secretly build this thing, we can actually have an advantage over other people. And that was kind of the way software development worked for probably the first 20, 30 years of the history of developing software. But then something curious happened in like the early and mid 90s. This concept of open source started to develop, and I think it really started in reality with a big project called Linux. A kid named Linus Torvalds decided that he was going to build an operating system over the winter in Helsinki, Finland. An operating system is something like Mac OS or Windows. It's a piece of software that essentially runs the computer. This isn't a piece of software that you would normally think of some kid, in college, tackling over a winter or in 4 months and building something like this. This is something that normally hundreds of people would work on at Microsoft or at Macintosh. These were huge projects, back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s and 90s at IBM and other places that developed operating systems. These are very heavy duty pieces of almost industrial like software. And this crazy kid named Linus Torvalds decided that he wanted to build one, and he called it Linux because his name is Linus. Well, he emerged after 4 months of a cold Helsinki winter with only sauna and programming, is my understanding. And he essentially shared it with the world. He just put it on the internet, and a couple of people saw what he was doing, and they thought it was interesting. They said, "Oh, this is pretty cool. We'd like to collaborate with you." And so they released the software under a license, a special license, that the only rule is you have to share it. You can't keep it for yourself. If you share it with customers, somebody that you sell it to, you have to share it with people for free. And so it kind of makes it live in perpetuity in this sort of free space. It's almost like a nonprofit where you can still do productive things, but you kind of give it away. And this confused a lot of people. People didn't understand what this open source thing was. Companies like Microsoft hated it when they first saw it. They thought it was destroying the software world, and it was taking over the world, and it was a cancer, and it would destroy the ability of software companies to make money. But they've come around since then, and the world's realized that this is actually a much better way of creating technology. Fast forward 25 years, and now there's millions of projects online, millions of these open source projects. Some are tiny, some are huge. They range the gambit. Linux is a very large one. Kubernetes is a very large one, and there's a whole bunch of other large ones. But there's also a lot of tiny, teeny tiny little projects where maybe it's a couple hundred lines of code that some kid, in college wrote and just decided to share it. And the concept of open source has evolved. It's evolved from sort of highly technical, very specialized people that could work on things like operating systems to pretty much anybody, from very intro programmers to people that have 20 years of experience. And this sort of culture is formed where it kind of builds your brand. It's quite similar to the way you make social media posts on Twitter or Facebook. You share your opinions and your thoughts and your vacations, and you sort of build your own personal brand. Well, the same is true with code, especially when you start with small pieces of code and you start to make small commitments to other projects, and you slowly but surely learn and build your brand, and other people get to kind of see how you interact in a group and collaborate with other people. And so you could think of like GitHub is a really famous place where this code is shared. You can think of it like Twitter for code. It's where all these different programmers all work together and share, and people build their brand. And so millions and millions of these sort of nonprofit for free, protected under a license that people can share it. And there's no harm, no foul. In fact, it's promoted to share the code and let everyone see what you're doing. This has pretty much become the default way that a lot of new technology, maybe not all, but a huge chunk is now developed. And then this creates an ecosystem for companies like Red Hat and Google and IBM and you name it, Facebook, to come along and kind of say, hey, we're participating in these upstream projects. And we have a lot of people that we employ that go and participate in these. Now we want to integrate them into like projects. And you could think of a project as something that somebody can install and use, right? A piece of software that maybe is made up of some of these smaller components that are out in the ecosystem. It kind of like you build a website out of a bunch of small parts. You can build programs out of a bunch of small parts, and then you can build something that's useful. And we call this integrating, as opposed to just participating upstream. And then some companies like Red Hat and even the cloud providers like IBM, Google, Azure, you name it. They take some of this and they stabilize it and they turn it into products. And it's this code that they've kind of turned into these projects often becomes the underpinnings for products like things that they sell, like services or actually packaged software where people buy it and install it on their computers. And so if you look over time, this is, to go back to the Linux example, I'll just delve into one of these. It says Fedora in the top left, and then it says Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Linux is an upstream project. It will boot a computer, and run, but you need a whole bunch of other stuff on top of it to truly run a computer. And so there's this thing called Fedora. You can think of it almost like a nonprofit. It's a community-driven effort that has an installable project. Like you literally put it on a DVD. You can burn it on a DVD. Boot your computer on it and literally install it, just like Windows or Mac OS. And you can install it in virtual machines or on your laptop or on servers. And this is a place where people experiment and play with code and like learn new things. And it moves very quickly, and there's a lot of innovation. Now, this is great for developing software, but often, other businesses where developing the technology is not one of their core competencies, they don't want to do that. Often, they just want to move slowly, and they want stable, and they want secure, and they want fast. They don't necessarily want the latest, greatest all the time. So, if you look to the left of Fedora, there, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that's actually a product. That's something that other companies, and people buy from Red Hat, and it's developed from Fedora and it's stabilized, but it's a different version of Linux that moves at its own speed and has its own uh, different pieces of software that are controlled, and its own documentation, et cetera, et cetera. So you can think of this ecosystem forms, and Red Hat's built a very large business out of this. In fact, last time we reported before we got acquired by IBM, this is getting close to a $2 billion number. And so we also did it across a bunch of other projects and products. And so I won't delve into all these, but Red Hat virtualization, satellite, Ansible, CloudForms. There's this is just showing 10, but Red Hat has a bunch of products. And this has kind of become a formula where you can just kind of go out to this open source ecosystem, find this innovation, pull these parts down, create projects that people can use and get to know as sort of a supply chain for these then products that you can sell and stabilize and secure. And so this is actually how people take free software and then end up making money from it. It's just one way, but it's interesting to kind of see that this scales out. So what does this have to do with Akron, Ohio? Well, I think it has to do with us thinking through innovation and maintenance. I hear a lot about startups, and we've always been obsessed with innovation, but we're not necessarily as excited about maintenance, even though maintenance makes our lives a lot better. So I always talk about, when a new bridge is built or a building's built or a ship is christened, we have tuxedo dinners, or we crack a bottle of wine open on the on the hull of the ship. There's a celebration whenever we have innovation. I guess it's easier to earmark and kind of know that something innovative happened when we construct something new. But we don't ever really celebrate when the bridge, High Street Bridge gets repaved or when Market Street gets repaved. There's not really a tuxedo dinner. Nobody's celebrating. I mean, I'm driving home. I'm celebrating a bit, but generally we don't have big get-togethers, and the construction workers don't get bonuses, and it's just part of their job, right? The same is true in a lot of economic areas, including software. And so I want us to think through maybe how remote work and open source fits into a little bit of both of these categories. So let's think through. Silicon Valley and Wall Street are obsessed with innovation, and I think that's definitely a part of our economic development for Northeast Ohio. I think it definitely has a role to play, but I think you can kind of go too far too. We look to people like Elon Musk, who says snarky, funny things like, "It's okay to have all of your eggs in one basket as long as you control what happens to that basket," and that's true, I guess. And it's pretty funny. It makes me chuckle, but it's not really the answer for Northeast Ohio. I'd say it's probably more appropriate to look to somebody like Warren Buffett, who has a funny saying, "Nobody wants to get rich slow." I think this is probably more our style. I think probably Akron and Northeast Ohio in general needs to think through, how do we get rich slow? As was mentioned before, a lot of the economic power of the region had left. The Cyberlings and whatnot are no longer here, and so a lot of the old money is essentially gone. And so we have to figure out how to get rich slow, like any family would. So let's think through, how open source and remote work might play a role here. It kind of fits into a little bit of both of these categories. We often celebrate, like I said, innovation, but we undervalue maintenance. Billionaires always love to brag about their angel investing when they were like early investors in some famous company like Uber or Facebook, and they love to talk about the millions of dollars they made. But we don't necessarily, as a society, celebrate, the 11% that a family making $65,000 a year eking by to save a little bit of money in Northeast Ohio saves that and makes money off that. We don't necessarily celebrate that at the same level. It doesn't necessarily hold the same prestige, but it's pretty important. We celebrate startups, and I think that's a critical role in our economic development in Northeast Ohio, but I don't think it's the only thing. I think there is some growth of existing companies, especially in the technology space. I think we celebrate new jobs in the region that are local, yet we kind of undervalue bringing remote jobs to the region. And I'll go in deeper into how I think it has a much larger impact than what we might give it credit for. And then, as I've spent 3 slides talking about, we get excited about open source and how new technologies developed. But we also do forget that proprietary software was a big chunk of our society for a long time. And in reality, a lot of business logic gets written that is essentially proprietary. So, like, if you look at all of the web development companies in Northeast Ohio, all of the code that they're developing on open source with open source tools is often has proprietary business logic that is only applicable to like one business. Certain businesses will have things that they do only for them, and so it's not really open source, but it's still important to the economic development of the region because it's a mix, of both. So my personal journey kind of started with a gentleman named Dave X. About 10, 12 years ago, I met him at the Akron Linux User Group, which is a local community-driven event or driven kind of community group, basically. And it's basically centered around a bunch of people that are interested in and use Linux. Some are professionals, some are hobbyists. And I used to present there. I would present about things that I was working on at IMG or at Interactive Media Group. And I think Dave X saw me present a few times and probably said to himself, I think this guy could do other jobs, and he kind of courted me a little bit about working at Red Hat. I said, hey, are you interested in working at Red Hat? And he probably talked to me for a year or a year and a half before I actually had the bravery to kind of apply for a job at Red Hat. But fast forward 9.5 years, I've been at Red Hat. And, I brought in a friend of mine who also worked with me at IMG, Patrick Regan. And I brought in another friend of mine who I'd known from Northeast Ohio through community, sort of some of these user groups as well around technology, Scott Sigmund. And then Scott Sigmund brought in a sales guy that he knew, Bob Simons. And so if you look, this is just 5 people as an example, but this keeps going and going and going. I now know of probably 10 or 15 Red Hat employees in Northeast Ohio, probably 40 or 50 in the state, and up in Michigan as well. And then think through this, because 60% of the people that come to Red Hat are actually brought in by referral, because referrals generally work better than just cold hires. Often the person will fit in better with the culture. They'll stay longer. They'll be able to do a better job. And I think this is true at every company, not just Red Hat, but we actually have the statistics that it's something like 60% of our hires actually come from referrals. And every company is doing this. So scale this out across other companies like Microsoft and Google and Datadog. And I'm aware of GitHub. I'm aware of a lot of other companies in Northeast Ohio that have employees here. And so, I know of easily 40 or 50 people doing that work here remotely and often work on open source software for some of these big companies. Scale this out. There's probably a couple thousand people in Northeast Ohio that are working like this. And so conservatively estimating this, this is probably a $300 million impact to the region per year. We're probably bringing in easily $300 million in revenue. And so here I just showed, if you were to calculate this at price to earnings like you would a stock, the standard they usually use is 19.4. Is the average of the S&P 500 over its entire history. This would be almost a $6 billion business. You could think of it as a virtual business because all these people work for different companies, but a lot of us all know each other, and a lot of us all go to same technology user groups, and a lot of us, are talent potential for other companies, and a lot of us are bringing in our friends and bringing them in as referrals, or people that we know, acquaintances, as referrals. So this is something that you get rich slowly. This helps the region get rich slowly, as I mentioned. So my personal journey, in a little bit deeper level, I'll bring you back to the 5 bullet points that I shared at the beginning. I started in inner city Akron, Ohio. I lived on Inman Street, and I went to Mason first grade. I went to Mickey Bright. I lived on Grant Street. I actually changed schools every year until 5th grade, where I actually ended up going to Silver Lake because I lived on the border of Cuyahoga Falls, which was a massive shock. I can tell you, coming from probably one of the poorest, grade schools in Akron for sure, to one of the richest, was definitely an experience. And then I spent, several years in Cuyahoga Falls, going to Falls High School. And then I went back and actually graduated from North High in North Akron. Then I tried to get famous in a punk band that failed. Although we did get big enough to actually play our biggest show here in Northeast Ohio was about 1,000 people. So we had moderate success, but it wasn't panning out to be a real career. And so, as I like to say, everybody in Northeast Ohio knows that a computer job is a good job, especially back in the mid 90s. We used to say, get yourself a computer job. That's a good job. And so, I fell back into enrolling at the University of Akron in computer science, and I quickly discovered this concept of open source. I had a good friend named Chad Ramesh that said, "Why don't you put Linux on your computer?" And I was like, "What word did you just say?" And fast forward 25-ish year, 20 plus years, and here we are, and I'm actually now professionally driving a roadmap for a large product. But I spent about 10 and a half years in college working full time, and so it was a slow, painful journey. But I did end up working 4 years at Interactive Media Group, and I did graduate from the University of Akron with a major in anthropology and a minor in computer science. After coming from high school with a 1.66 grade point average, I thought that was pretty decent. And then, like I mentioned, Dave X, kind of approached me about Red Hat. I ended up changing careers. I was more of a technical person. I worked more like a programmer. I was something called a sysadmin. But I worked directly with the technology, and then I moved into sales. So I changed roles. I ended up covering Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Indiana. I drove all over corn country and learned a lot about, at Interactive Media Group, I learned a lot about local businesses and how the economy worked. And then when I joined Red Hat, I learned a lot more about how the national economy worked, and how, a lot of these national and international businesses work. And so eventually, after about 4 years of that, I actually joined our product teams. And then I started to kind of really, truly learn product management and product marketing and how business works truly internationally. And I've, fast forward 5 years of doing that, and I've visited 6 continents, 35 countries, 100 cities. And then I work with a very large team, across China and Brno in the Czech Republic and South America and all over the United States. These these open source communities, like everything that Red Hat does is open source. So our team works all over the place. And so it's by its nature, it's very remote oriented. And so this is why I think it's special and has a role to play in especially for Northeast Ohio. These kinds of jobs I think are quite unique. And so I just wanted to, share that with you and share how I think open source and remote work are affecting Northeast Ohio. And I think it's a much bigger number than a lot of people think. So I just want to say thank you for joining me. Take care.